Welcome. You've had a long day. The lights are low, the world outside has gone quiet, and it's time to let your mind drift, not into chaos or noise but into a slower, simpler time. Tonight we're traveling back hundreds of years. To a world without electricity. Without central heating. Without the comfort of modern life. To the dead of winter in the Middle Ages, when survival meant more than just staying warm. It meant knowing how to prepare your home, your family, and yourself for months of darkness and cold. But don't worry, nothing here is urgent. There are no dramatic twists, no loud moments. Just the quiet story of how peasants lived, loved, and endured the frostbite of history, one snow-covered day at a time. So tuck in. Let the slow rhythm of the past soothe your mind. And if you enjoy this peaceful journey into the forgotten world of medieval winters, gently tap the like button. Subscribe for more sleepy stories. And leave a comment sharing the coziest thing you're wrapped in right now. Now close your eyes or keep them soft on the screen and let's begin. With the smell of smoke from a hearth fire, the creak of old wooden beams, and the crunch of frost beneath a pair of wool-wrapped feet. Imagine yourself walking down a narrow dirt path in the early winter dusk. The air smells of smoke and damp earth, and your breath escapes in little puffs as your boots press into the frozen mud. To your left and right are the homes of medieval peasants. Low to the ground, with thatched roofs and crooked timbers, these cottages look more like part of the land than structures upon it. Time hasn't been gentle to them, but time was never meant to be. Each home is a humble creation of necessity. Built not for comfort, but for endurance. The walls, you'll notice, aren't made of bricks or cut stone. They're made of wattle and daub, a woven lattice of wooden strips, covered in a sticky mixture of clay, soil, straw, and sometimes even animal dung. It sounds primitive. And it is. But it's surprisingly effective. When dried, it forms a tough barrier that keeps the wind out and the warmth in. At least, as much warmth as could be mustered in a time without insulation. The roofs above are thick bundles of thatch, bundled reeds or straw layered tightly. They're waterproof when well maintained, but they do let in the occasional rat or bird looking for shelter. That's the price of sharing the world so closely with nature. Step inside one of these homes. Mind your head, the doorframe is low. People in the Middle Ages weren't much shorter, but ceilings were kept low to trap heat. Inside the space is small. One room, maybe two if the family is fortunate. The floor is dirt. Not packed clay or boards, just earth. Sometimes covered in rushes or straw, often with herbs mixed into mask smells. Over time, the floor becomes layered with dropped food, bits of ash, and whatever clings to shoes. It is swept occasionally, raked perhaps, but never washed. Dirt is part of daily life. In the center of the room, the heart of every home, the hearth. A simple open fire pit, often dug into the floor, sometimes raised and framed by stones. Above it, a hole in the roof lets the smoke escape, but only just. The walls and beams are stained black from years of fires burning through the long, dark winters. Everything happens around the hearth. Cooking, mending, storytelling, sleeping. Its fire gives heat, light, and life. When the fire goes out, the home goes cold, and with it, hope becomes harder to hold on to. To one side, you'll see the bed platform, made of wooden planks and a mattress of straw stuffed into linen or wool. Everyone shares it. Parents, children, sometimes grandparents, even visiting travelers or neighbors in need. Privacy wasn't a concept. Warmth was more important. Against the walls are hooks with bundles of clothing, thick woolen cloaks, mittens, shawls. Not many. Just a few. They're patched and worn, repaired countless times. Every thread is precious. Every hole is a problem. There's a chest for tools, maybe a small table, a bench. And hanging herbs from the rafters. Dried nettles, mint, sage, collected in summer and saved for winter teas and tinctures. The windows are small and unglassed, just wooden shutters that are closed tightly at night. Sometimes covered with animal skin, stretched thin and dried to let in light without letting out all the warmth. But in truth, there's not much warmth to lose. Even in the daylight, the home is dim. Candles are made from tallow, animal fat, so they're smoky and foul-smelling. You use them sparingly. Only when the firelight isn't enough. During the coldest weeks, animals might be brought indoors. Chickens, maybe a goat or piglet. Their breath, their warmth, and their waste all part of the shared space. Children sleep bundled in cloaks and hand-me-downs, curled up against their parents or pressed close to the hearth. Dogs are treasured, sometimes not just as pets but as extra body heat. The family eats seated around the hearth. A wooden bowl of pottage, always the same stew, reheated and thickened with whatever is on hand. Bread if they're lucky. Salt only occasionally. The walls creak. The wind howls. But the fire crackles steadily and the air inside, though smoky, is safe. Familiar. This is what home meant in the medieval winter. Not peace. Not luxury. But protection. A fragile shell between life and the frost. You see, the home wasn't just a place to live, it was a tool for survival. Built not to look pretty, but to withstand months of bitter cold, biting winds and endless darkness. In the daylight hours, the fire is kept burning by the oldest child or the mother while others go out to work or gather. Keeping it alive is essential. Starting it again if it goes out is difficult, especially without flint or matches. So it is guarded, fed, and watched like a baby. There are rituals around it. Ashes are banked over the coals each night to keep them hot until morning. Wood is rationed, with bigger logs for night and smaller ones for dawn. Every piece of fuel is used wisely. The home itself changes over the years. Roofs collapse and are rebuilt. Walls crack and are patched. It lives in its own way along with the family that inhabits it. Over time, generations live in the same structure. Children born, elders buried, and winters endured, together under one leaky, smoky, precious roof. We often imagine castles and halls when we picture the past. But this simple, soot-dark, straw-scented shelter, this is what most people called home. And as the snow fell and the winds moaned outside, they were grateful for it. No matter how rough or how small, it was a barrier between survival and surrender. It was warmth, however fragile. And in the Middle Ages, that was everything. So tonight, as you lie warm beneath modern blankets, in a room with insulated walls and quiet, humming heat, remember this simple one-room cottage and the generations who survived inside it. Let their firelight flicker softly in your thoughts. As we now turn to what they did to feed themselves, through the long, lean months of winter. Imagine the seasons shifting. The last leaves have fallen. The air grows sharp and the earth hardens underfoot. It's November, and for a medieval peasant, this marks more than a change in temperature. It marks the beginning of the great test. A test of preparation, patience, and hope. Because once the land freezes, nothing more will grow. No fresh vegetables. No soft fruit. No meat, unless you're willing to slaughter what little livestock you still have. For the next 4 or 5 months, you survive on what you have already stored. And only that. So let's go back just a bit, to the end of summer and the early autumn months. This is when the entire village worked together to harvest every single thing they could from the land. Cabbages, onions, turnips, leeks, beans, grains like rye, barley, and oats. Everything had to be picked, collected, processed, and preserved. Not a single root or grain could be wasted. Because every handful not saved was a handful missing when the snow came. Once gathered, the food had to be kept from spoiling. There were no refrigerators. No plastic containers or canned goods. So peasants used methods as old as civilization itself. They dried what they could. Apples were sliced thin and hung from strings near the hearth, shriveling slowly over the weeks. Beans were laid out to dry on cloth and stored in clay jars. Even some herbs were bundled and tied, left to hang in the rafters: sage, thyme, chamomile. Tiny pieces of flavor and medicine hidden in leaves. Root vegetables were stored differently. They were placed in cool, dark places, root cellars dug into the earth. Simple holes, sometimes lined with stone, sometimes not. Covered with boards and straw to keep out the frost. Inside, the temperature stayed just above freezing. Perfect for storing carrots, parsnips, turnips, and cabbages. Some foods were salted. Especially meat, when they could get it. A pig might be slaughtered in the late fall, just before the coldest weather. Its meat would be rubbed with salt and sometimes hung to dry in a smokehouse, if the village had one. Ham, bacon, sausage, these weren't everyday foods. They were precious, eaten in the smallest of portions. Often only during celebrations or when hard labor demanded it. Fish, too, was preserved this way. Salted cod, dried herring. Tough and chewy but nourishing. Grain was perhaps the most important of all. Barley, oats, rye. Stored in sacks, sometimes woven from coarse flax or wool. kept off the floor to protect from moisture and rats. This grain was ground, often in a communal mill, into coarse flour or meal. But even flour could go bad. It could mold. It could attract insects. So it was guarded carefully. And used wisely. Most of it became bread. But not the kind we know today. No soft white slices. No golden crusts or fluffy centers. Medieval bread was heavy. Dense. Dark from rye or barley. Often sour from long fermentation. And because the flour was ground between large stone wheels, it contained grit, tiny shards of rock. People in those days had worn down teeth not from candy, but from years of chewing what was essentially edible sandpaper. Still, bread was sacred. So sacred that to waste it was to risk being cursed. Crumbs were collected and used. The heel of the loaf was often given to the eldest. No piece went uneaten. For the poor, bread and pottage were everything. Pottage was a thick stew. A blend of whatever you had, grains, vegetables, herbs. Sometimes beans. Occasionally a bone for flavor. If you were lucky, a few scraps of bacon or lard. It simmered constantly over the fire, added to daily. Never fully emptied. Just replenished. This was called the eternal pot. A never-ending meal that changed each day, based on what was available. In some homes, the pot stayed on the fire for weeks. Thick with nutrients, and, perhaps, a little too much history. To us this might seem unpleasant. But in a world without waste it was wise. People drank from wooden cups. A weak ale or warm herbal infusion. Water, as we've said before, was often unsafe. So beer, mild and brewed quickly, was the safest drink. Children drank it. Elders drank it. It was thinner with less alcohol than our modern drinks. But it warmed the body and it gave energy. Honey, if found, was a rare treasure. Used for both sweetness and medicine. It was harvested with care from wild hives. Stored in ceramic pots. And guarded like gold. Eggs were precious too. Hens didn't lay much in winter. And those that did were carefully tended. A single egg might be divided among 2 or 3 children. Cheese could be made in late summer and kept cool for months. A hard, sharp cheese, sour but filling. And for sweets? Perhaps a dried plum, a handful of nuts, a spoonful of jam sealed in wax. That was celebration food. Everything had a season. And every bite in winter was a bite earned months before. Food was not just nourishment. It was security. It was the difference between making it to spring or not. That's why the entire year circled around the harvest. Even the church calendar aligned with it. Feast days came after fast, and fasts in turn helped stretch dwindling supplies. Fasting wasn't just a spiritual practice. It was a survival tactic. Hunger taught discipline. It taught reverence. It reminded everyone that the earth gave what it could, and no more. And so, as snow fell gently outside and the wind whispered beneath the door, a family would gather close around the hearth. A pot of pottage bubbling softly. A loaf of bread broken with care. A bit of ale shared from a cup. No feasts. No banquets. Just enough. Just enough to last the night. And, hopefully, the next. This rhythm, of planting, harvesting, storing, and rationing, was life. And it taught lessons modern comfort can sometimes make us forget. That food is precious. That nothing is guaranteed. And that the warmth of a simple meal shared with people you love can be the greatest luxury in a cold and uncertain world. So as you rest now, in your warm bed, know that the peasants of the past worked hard so they could simply eat. And in that simplicity, there was wisdom. The kind that says, eat what you have. Waste nothing. Be thankful. And always prepare for winter. In the heart of winter, in a time before thermostats and radiators, staying warm was not a comfort. It was a conquest. The kind of challenge that shaped your entire daily rhythm. For the medieval peasant, surviving the cold wasn't just about one good coat or a cozy blanket. It was about strategy, endurance, and using every resource available to keep the chill from stealing into your bones. The fire was everything. It was the single most important tool for warmth and survival. Whether you lived in a tiny wattle-and-daub cottage or a smoky hut on the edge of the forest, you lived around the hearth. Every movement, every task, every breath in winter centered on keeping that fire alive. It was a ritual passed down through generations, tending to embers, placing the right kind of wood at the right time, and shielding the flames from wind and moisture. But firewood wasn't always easy to come by. You couldn't just chop down trees at will. In many places, forests were owned by nobles, and gathering wood without permission could cost you dearly, sometimes even your hand. Instead, peasants gathered what they could: fallen branches, broken twigs, dry brambles, and peat from bogs. They'd walk for miles to find just enough kindling for a single day. Dung was often dried and burned too. It didn't smell pleasant, but it burned slow and long. On especially cold nights, families would huddle close together by the hearth. Parents, children, and sometimes even the livestock. It wasn't unusual for chickens or piglets to be brought indoors. Not for affection, but for heat. The combined body warmth of family members and animals could make a real difference. You didn't have privacy, but you had warmth. And in the Middle Ages, that was a trade worth making. Clothing, too, became part of the strategy. Every layer mattered. People wore wool, lots of it. Heavy cloaks, long tunics, layered shifts, and hose. Linen was used underneath to protect the skin, and everything was kept on for as long as possible. You didn't have 10 outfits. You had 1 or 2, maybe a special cloak passed down from a grandmother, repaired countless times with rough stitches and love. And you slept in your clothes. Every night. Children were often bundled into large woolen wraps and tucked into the bed's warmest corners. The family bed wasn't a place of luxury but a necessity. Everyone piled in, and the warmth from shared bodies was enough to get through the night. Blankets were made of rough, scratchy materials, sometimes layered with straw or lined with old furs. Wealthier homes might have feather mattresses and pelts, but for the average peasant, warmth came from closeness, not possessions. There were no heated floors or sealed windows. The wind slipped through cracks in the walls and whistled beneath doors. Shutters were drawn tight at sundown and sealed with cloths or straw bundles. Some homes hung heavy fabric over the doors, primitive curtains meant to trap heat. They didn't work perfectly, but they were better than nothing. At night, once the hearth fire had died down, the embers were banked, covered with ash to preserve heat until morning. Starting a fire from scratch was hard. Flint and steel were tricky, and matches didn't exist yet. So every peasant learned to protect the fire like a living thing. To let it die was not just inconvenient, it was dangerous. There were tricks, of course. Secrets passed down through families. Some people placed hot stones in their bedding before sleep. Heated near the fire, then wrapped in cloth and slid between straw mattresses. It wasn't fancy, but it helped keep the worst of the cold at bay. Others used bottles or pots filled with hot water or embers, carefully insulated. These makeshift warmers were reused for generations. Even daily chores changed with the weather. You worked near the fire whenever possible, mending clothes, preparing food, crafting tools. Tasks that required outdoor effort, like feeding animals or fetching water, were done as quickly as possible, often with frozen fingers and stiff limbs. Frostbite wasn't a word they used, but they knew its pain intimately. Children were taught early how to wrap their feet in wool, how to move their fingers constantly while working, how to breathe through cloth to protect their lungs. And yet, despite all this effort, it was still cold. Always cold. The kind of cold that settles into your spine and never fully leaves. That numbs your fingers and makes your teeth chatter even when you're inside. Some winters were worse than others. Famously harsh years brought snowstorms that buried cottages, froze rivers solid, and sent entire families into desperation. In those times, warmth became a myth, a memory of summer heat, carried only in stories. Still, the people endured. They sang songs while working by the fire. They told stories to pass the long, dark nights. Grandmothers whispered tales of winters worse than this one. Children clung to every word, partly in fear, partly in wonder. The stories made the cold more bearable. They gave it shape, context. They made it something you could survive because others had survived before. In some villages, winter brought a sense of shared hardship. Neighbors helped each other, sharing firewood, trading blankets, mending cloaks. If a roof collapsed under snow, men from the village would help rebuild it. If a family ran out of peat or food, others would pitch in. Not out of luxury but out of necessity. Because if one household failed, others might follow. Winter didn't play favorites. There was a strange sort of beauty in it, too. In the way firelight danced across soot-darkened walls. In the way snow muffled the world, turning it quiet and still. In the rhythm of breathing beside the fire, the creak of rafters, the crackle of burning wood. The cold forced people to slow down, to sit, to be still, to exist in the moment and wait for the thaw. Even in noble homes and castles, warmth was never guaranteed. Large stone halls were often colder than peasant huts. The walls, thick as they were, radiated damp chill. Fires burned in grand hearths, but heat rarely traveled far. Tapestries were hung not just for beauty but to block drafts. Nobles wrapped themselves in layers of velvet and fur, drank warm mead, and kept dogs at their feet for comfort. The poor weren't the only ones who shivered. And yet, when spring returned, when the first green shoots pushed through the melting snow, when the rivers began to run again, people stepped outside and knew they had made it. They had survived another winter. Not just through chance or luck, but through planning, patience, and relentless determination. The cold had tried to break them. And once again, it had failed. In the dead of winter, when the wind howled through the thatched rooftops and frost clung to every window pane like a silver veil, the first and most immediate defense a medieval peasant had was what they wore. Clothing wasn't fashion. It wasn't decoration. It was armor against the cold, carefully layered, patched, mended, and layered again. For those living far from castles and riches, every garment was both a necessity and a story, of work, of love, and of making do with very little. In the medieval countryside, clothing started with the inner layer, the linen shift. It was simple, undyed, often hand-sewn from flax fibers grown and processed nearby. For men, this meant a long tunic-like undershirt. For women, a full-length gown worn directly against the skin. Linen was prized because it could be washed, one of the only layers that often was, and it acted as a barrier between the body and the coarser fabrics on top. Next came the wool. Wool was the miracle fiber of the Middle Ages. Warm when wet, naturally insulating, durable, and available across most regions. Sheep were everywhere, and their wool clothed the entire continent. Spun on drop spindles or rudimentary wheels, the wool was woven into thick fabric on handlooms and then turned into tunics, hose, cloaks, and caps. Dyes were few and subtle: browns, grays, dull reds and greens, muted blues made from woad. But more often than not, a peasant wore undyed raw-colored garments, the earthy tones of the sheep themselves. Men wore wool tunics over their shifts, belted at the waist. Their legs were wrapped in woolen hose, close-fitting tubes that covered each leg separately, often tied to a belt or girdle under their tunic. Some had wool trousers, loose or fitted depending on region and resources. Women wore longer tunics or dresses, sometimes with aprons and additional skirts layered over the base. The wealthy, of course, had finer garments. Softer wool. Brighter dyes. More variety. But even they knew the importance of layering. Status did not shield you from cold stone walls and freezing drafts. A key layer during winter was the surcoat or overtunic, thicker, heavier, meant to hold in warmth. These might be lined with fur if available, or simply sewn with extra woolen padding. A good overtunic was treasured, handed down, repaired 100 times. You didn't throw clothes away. You repurposed them. An old tunic became a child's garment, then rags, then stuffing for a pillow, then fuel for a fire in desperate moments. For the harshest weather, there was the cloak, a long, hooded, heavy piece of wool that covered almost the entire body. Fastened at the shoulder or chest with a brooch or simple tie, it was your blanket, your windbreak, your shelter when traveling. The hood, or cowl, was particularly important. It kept heat from escaping and protected the neck and ears from bitter winds. Many were attached to cloaks, others were worn separately and tucked into tunics for extra warmth. Children were wrapped similarly, small versions of adult outfits. Little woolen shifts and cloaks, hats and mittens if you could make them. They were dressed in layers, not out of overprotection, but because every ounce of body heat mattered. Babies were swaddled tightly in wool and slept close to the fire, often in baskets or wooden cradles with hot stones wrapped in cloth for added warmth. Footwear was another battleground. Most peasants wore leather shoes or boots, thin, soft-soled, made from cowhide or goatskin. They were hand-stitched, often with no inner lining, and wore out quickly. In winter, these shoes were stuffed with straw, moss, or wool scraps to provide insulation. Socks were rare luxuries. Most people simply wrapped their feet in strips of cloth, what we might call foot bindings, layered tightly to trap heat. Gloves were uncommon, especially among the poor. If you had something to cover your hands, it was often a pair of thick woolen mittens, perhaps made by a grandmother or passed down from an older sibling. Many simply worked bare-handed, using pockets of their tunics or cloaks to warm their fingers when the pain grew too sharp. Hats were critical. The old saying, "You lose most of your heat through your head," was instinctively understood even back then. Woolen caps, simple, snug, and sometimes pointy, were worn indoors and out. In bed, people often kept their hats on along with all their clothes. Sleeping in full dress was entirely normal, especially in the coldest months. There was no changing into pajamas. There were no wardrobes or closets. Your garments lived on you or on a peg near the fire, steaming after a day spent outside in the snow. Washing clothing was a seasonal event, not a weekly chore. In the cold of winter, it was practically impossible. No hot water unless you boiled it. No soap except harsh lye or ash-based scrubs. No place to dry things quickly without freezing them solid. So garments were rarely washed in winter. Instead, people used layers to create a barrier between skin and dirt. The linen shift might be washed every few weeks if possible. The outer garments? Maybe once a season. Because of this, clothing took on the scent of smoke, sweat, soil, and home. Each person's outfit was part of their identity, not in the way fashion is today, but as an extension of their labor, their status, and their survival. You could often tell how hard someone worked by the condition of their sleeves, or how many winters they'd seen by the patches on their cloak. There was dignity in mending. A mother teaching her daughter to stitch a tear in a hem wasn't just passing down skill, it was passing down the ability to survive. A patch wasn't a flaw. It was a badge of wisdom. Proof that you knew how to endure. In some areas, furs were used, but not in abundance. The noble classes had fox, ermine, and sable, often worn with the fur facing inward for warmth and luxury. Peasants, when they had access, might use sheepskin, rabbit pelts, or whatever was available locally. These were often sewn into cloaks or lined shoes, rather than worn decoratively. A single pelt could mean the difference between tolerable cold and agony. People understood this. And so, every scrap of fabric, every piece of leather, every stitch of wool had purpose. Travel during winter added further challenges. If you had to go out, whether to tend livestock, gather firewood, or attend church, you wrapped yourself in everything you had. 2 cloaks, 3 tunics, whatever layers you could find. Scarves if you had them. Mittens borrowed or shared. In blizzards, travelers would arrive at a neighbor's home looking like walking haystacks, so bundled they could barely move. And inside the home, where fire offered a limited radius of warmth, you still dressed in layers. People sat close to the hearth not only for heat but because their outer limbs, fingers, toes, noses, needed constant tending. Children curled beside the dog. Elders wrapped themselves in shawls. And everyone, without exception, knew how to sit still without letting the cold creep in too far. Clothing was utility. A tool. A legacy. In the humblest of cottages, stitched by hand, passed between generations, it wasn't uncommon for a tunic to outlive its first owner. A pair of boots, resold 4 times, might still see one more winter. Nothing was wasted. Nothing could be. And in the silent hours of those bitter nights, as snow piled up outside and breath curled like mist in the air, a peasant lay under rough wool blankets, wearing everything they owned, holding the fire's warmth inside their layers. It wasn't glamorous, but it was enough. In a world where the earth froze solid for months at a time, water became one of the greatest challenges of winter. It's easy to forget just how much we depend on it, not only to drink but to clean, to cook, to wash our bodies, our clothes, our tools, and our homes. But in medieval times, especially in winter, water was something you earned. In the warm seasons, rivers, wells, and rain barrels offered what you needed. You could walk to the nearest stream or lower a bucket into a community well and return home with the cold weight of water sloshing at your side. But winter changed everything. Rivers froze. wells iced over. Barrels became blocks of solid ice. And if you didn't plan ahead, you might find yourself without a drop when you needed it most. Fetching water was usually the work of women and children. Even in winter, someone had to go out each day, sometimes multiple times, bundled in rough wool, hands wrapped in cloth, to break the ice from the well or chip frozen chunks from the stream. These were not small tasks. The buckets were heavy. The ground was slippery. The air stung like needles. And the water, when you finally got to it, burned your hands like fire. If the family was lucky enough to live near a running stream, they'd carve a hole through the ice and return to it each morning, praying it hadn't frozen over too deeply in the night. Others had to carry tools, a hammer, a pickaxe, anything, to break through the thick shell of ice that formed around their water supply. Then came the careful walk home, hoping not to spill a drop. Once inside, the water was stored in jugs, barrels, or wooden pails by the hearth. But even indoors, it didn't stay warm for long. In uninsulated cottages with wind creeping in through every gap, water froze in the corners of rooms. Steam rose from buckets only briefly. Most families kept water close to the fire, not just for cooking but to prevent it from turning useless. Bathing, in the modern sense, was a rare and deliberate act. There were no daily showers or baths. No soap pumps or running taps. A bath, when it happened, was a major production. You had to gather the wood, heat the water over the hearth, and pour it into a large wooden tub, if you even had one. Most peasants didn't. They might use a basin, a bucket, or nothing at all. When the bath did come, it was usually a shared experience. Parents bathed children first, then themselves, often in the same water. There was a saying in some regions, "Don't throw the baby out with the bath water," a grim joke rooted in the fact that by the time the last person washed, the water was nearly black. Soap, if used at all, was rough and homemade, often from animal fat and ash. But most people didn't bathe in winter. Not fully. The fear wasn't just the cold. It was belief. Many thought that bathing opened the pores, making you vulnerable to sickness. In truth, bathing in cold weather without proper drying could indeed be dangerous. The risk of hypothermia was real. And so, instead of washing, people scrubbed their faces and hands with cloths. They changed the inner linen shift when they could. They might wash their feet in warm water once a week. But overall, hygiene was about maintaining, not cleansing. Smells were accepted. Dirt was normal. People didn't expect to feel fresh. Instead, they managed. Herbs were burned to mask odors. Sprigs of rosemary or lavender were hung near sleeping areas. Clean snow, when fresh and powdery, might be used to wipe the face or even brush the teeth. These were small rituals, not about purity but about feeling human. Toileting added its own set of challenges. In towns and castles, there might be designated latrines, chamber pots, or rudimentary garderobes built into the outer walls. But in peasant homes, the solution was much simpler, and far colder. Most families used a chamber pot, a bucket or ceramic bowl, tucked under the bed or beside the hearth. In the morning it was carried out and emptied. Where? Into a cesspit, a hole dug behind the house, or sometimes just tossed into the street or a ditch. There was no toilet paper. People used moss, leaves, straw, or scraps of cloth, washed if possible but often discarded. In richer homes, bits of old linen or even wool were reserved for this purpose. The Romans had once used sponges on sticks, rinsed in vinegar. But in the medieval countryside, such refinement was lost. Hygiene then was a matter of practicality, of resilience. You did what you could. You scraped mud from your boots, you shook lice from your hair with special combs, you rinsed your hands in cold water before meals, not always but when possible. The idea of clean was different. It meant keeping disease away, not achieving perfection. Illness was feared not just for its pain but for its consequences. A simple infection could mean death. An unclean wound could fester. A sick child might not survive the season. So people learned what mattered. Washing out cuts with wine or vinegar. Avoiding foul water. Not bathing too often in cold weather. Listening to the old women who knew which herbs could calm a fever. There were village remedies, of course. Boiled thyme for sore throats. Honey and ash for wounds. Onion poultices and garlic salves. Healing wasn't sterile, It was earthy, full of smell and heat and prayer. You might not wash your body, but you boiled your tools. You didn't bathe daily, but you sat in steam when sick. You didn't sterilize, but you burned herbs. And somehow many lived. Still, water remained sacred. Even when it was hard to come by. Even when it burned your skin with cold. Even when it froze in the cup beside your bed. It was gathered carefully, carried gently, used wisely. Every drop mattered. In noble homes, servants did the carrying. Stone pitchers lined the walls of cold halls. Basins were placed in bedrooms. But even nobles had limits. Their bathwater was hauled bucket by bucket. Their linens were washed and boiled in great copper pots. Their wealth insulated them, but only so much. When winter came, even lords could shiver. And so, the peasant woman bent over the well. The child chipped ice from the bucket. The father melted snow in a blackened pan. Day after day. Without complaint. Because without water, nothing else could follow. In the quietest moments of the darkest months, when the fire hissed low and the wind clawed at the windows, a basin of warm water could feel like a miracle. A cloth on the forehead. A foot washed before bed. A hand rinsed before supper. Small mercies. It wasn't enough to keep you clean. But it was enough to remind you. When winter tightened its grip on the countryside and the last green leaf had long withered under frost, peasants turned inward, not just for shelter but for sustenance. There were no supermarkets. No late-night snacks. No trucks delivering fresh produce. Survival in winter depended entirely on what you had prepared months before. Your winter diet wasn't about taste. It was about calories. And every bite mattered. The peasant table, if one could even call it that, was humble. In the cold months, meals were mostly hot, thick, and repetitive. You weren't eating for pleasure. You were eating to last another day. At the heart of nearly every peasant meal was something called pottage, a slow-boiled stew of vegetables, grains, and whatever scraps could be spared. There was no fixed recipe. Each pot was as unique as the family who made it. Sometimes it simmered for days, with ingredients added and removed as needed. Barley, oats, beans, cabbage, leeks, garlic, all softened into a grayish mash that filled the stomach and warmed the hands. Flavor wasn't the goal. Survival was. If you were lucky, a marrow bone or small piece of meat might flavor the broth. Not much, just enough to enrich the pot. Meat was rare in winter. Livestock had to be preserved, and most animals were slaughtered in late autumn before feed ran out. Their meat was salted, smoked, or dried. Only the wealthiest had fresh cuts through the cold months. For peasants, a cube of bacon fat dropped into pottage was a gift. A sliver of dried sausage could stretch across multiple meals. Grains were essential. Bread, despite its simplicity, was life. It wasn't fluffy or fresh. It was dense, dark, and often a little sour. Baked in community ovens or at home over open flames, bread might be made from rye, barley, or even ground peas when wheat was scarce. The loaves were thick, meant to last, and could be sliced, toasted, or crumbled into stews. They were so vital that running out was almost unthinkable. But not all bread was safe. Ergot, a toxic fungus that grows on rye, often contaminated poorly stored grain. It caused hallucinations, burning sensations, convulsions, even death. Historians believe entire villages may have suffered mass delusions because of tainted bread. People saw demons, accused neighbors of witchcraft, and fell into fits, when in truth it was the rye. But when you're hungry and desperate, even poisonous bread might seem worth the risk. Other staples included porridge, made from oats or millet, and gruel, a thinner version often fed to children or the elderly. These were eaten with wooden spoons, hot and steaming, scooped from communal pots. You didn't eat alone. Meals were family affairs, not out of sentiment but practicality. There was only so much heat. Only so much food. Eating together meant sharing both. Protein came in creative forms. Cheese, made from summer milk and aged for months, could be sliced or crumbled into meals. Eggs, when hens continued to lay, were precious. But winter was lean. Many chickens stopped laying and milk often ran dry. Cows needed food to produce milk, and hay was reserved for survival, not abundance. A single egg in January might be split between children. Beans and legumes were crucial. fava beans, peas, lentils, all dried in summer then soaked and stewed in winter. They were the peasants' meat. Hearty, filling, full of what the body needed to keep working in cold fields and forests. Then came the preserves. Root cellars stored turnips, onions, parsnips and carrots, kept from freezing by straw and earth. Pickled cabbage, early versions of sauerkraut, provided rare vitamin C. Without it, scurvy set in and gums bled long before spring returned. Fruit preserves were rare but loved. Apples sliced and dried on rooftops, plums cooked into thick pastes, berries turned into vinegars or wines. A spoonful of jam wasn't dessert. It was medicine for the spirit. And of course there was ale. Not the heady brew we know today but small beer, a weak, lightly fermented drink brewed at home or in local taverns. It was safer than water, which froze or festered with disease. Even children drank it, diluted and warm. 8 to 10 pints a day wasn't unusual. It quenched thirst, filled bellies and killed off bacteria. The brewing process was as much a part of the home as cooking. Yeast was kept in jars. Barley was soaked, boiled and strained. And every woman knew her own recipe. In richer households, the winter table had more variety. Salted hams, smoked fish, hard cheeses, dried fruits, imported spices. But even there the cold bit deep and kitchens worked around it. Fires were kept burning all day. Servants bundled in cloaks as they cooked. And still, the most opulent meals in December could be humbler than a farmer's autumn feast. For the poor, fasting days imposed by the church meant even fewer meals. No meat, no dairy, no eggs. Just bread, vegetables and water, or ale. These fasts were spiritual but also practical. They stretched supplies. They slowed consumption. They reminded people, God was watching and hunger was holy. Hunger was also constant. Not the sharp pangs of a missed lunch, but the dull ache of weeks without enough. Children cried quietly at night. Mothers skipped meals to feed the smallest. Men worked with hollow stomachs and numb fingers. A good day meant 2 meals. A bad day meant broth and hope. And when spring came late, winter grew long. But even in scarcity, creativity thrived. Families used stale bread and porridge. Bones were boiled twice, thrice until every bit of marrow was drawn out. Ashes from the hearth were sometimes used to preserve eggs. Snow was melted and strained to drink. Pine needles steeped in boiling water made tea with just enough vitamin C to fight scurvy. And when food ran thin, wild herbs and bark found their way into pots. Chewy, bitter, but better than nothing. Feasts, though rare, broke the monotony. Yule brought community meals, shared pies, boiled puddings, roasted meats if they were available. Bread spiced with cinnamon if you could afford it. Honeyed nuts, dried apples, meat. These weren't everyday foods. They were glimpses of warmth, symbols of hope, tasted slowly by the firelight. Children waited all year for those moments. For the sweet bite of a preserved plum. For the rich steam of a shared pudding. For the laughter that came briefly when everyone forgot the cold. Because in the end, the winter diet wasn't just about food. It was about ingenuity, ritual, and the quiet defiance of going to bed full, even if just barely. Every stew was a victory. Every loaf a shield. And every mouthful proof that life, even under snow and sky, would go on. In the medieval countryside, there were no idle hands. Not in summer and certainly not in winter. When the cold set in and the world outside turned white and still, the work inside the cottage came alive. The home was no longer just a place to sleep, it was a place to survive. And survival meant everyone, from the oldest grandparent to the smallest child, had a job. Medieval families were not built like modern ones. They were often large, extended, and tightly interwoven. Grandparents, parents, aunts, uncles, and children might all live beneath the same sagging thatched roof. Privacy didn't exist. But what did exist was purpose. Each person had their role, and in winter those roles were even more crucial. The head of the household, usually the father or eldest male, had to ensure that supplies were properly rationed and stored. He kept an eye on the firewood, checked the cellar, mended tools, and repaired anything that broke under the weight of the cold. He might go out to trap small game, collect fresh water, or reinforce the roof with mud and straw. His presence was the spine of the family's routine, and when he wasn't working, he was planning. But the true heart of the winter home? That was often the mother. Women in medieval villages didn't stop moving, even as the snow piled high against the door. They prepared food in the cold morning light, kept the hearth burning, stirred the pottage, baked the bread, and warmed the water. They patched torn tunics, spun thread, mended worn stockings, and fed children from what little was left in the pantry. Their hands smelled of ash and garlic, their backs ached from stooping, and their minds ticked like clocks, always thinking 3 days ahead, always calculating how to make one small sack of flour last until the thaw. But children too were part of the daily machinery. At an age when many modern children are still learning to tie their shoes, medieval children were tying bundles of kindling, helping feed the chickens, and learning how to sew. A boy of 6 might be sent with his older brother to check the traps or bring in water from the stream. A girl of 7 could help her mother stir the pot, knead dough, or keep the baby quiet. By 10, most children could do almost every task an adult could. There was no waiting to grow up. Life made you grow quickly. And the elderly? They were not burdens. They were the keepers of knowledge. Grandmothers sat near the hearth, teaching girls how to spin wool or embroider patterns into cloth. Grandfathers taught boys how to whittle, how to fix a cracked door, how to patch the handle of a broken ladle with string and hope. They told stories, remembered the hard winters of years past, and reminded everyone how the family had survived before. Their eyes saw the present, but their minds carried centuries of wisdom. Even the sick or frail found ways to contribute. Sorting dried herbs. Watching over young children. Feeding the fire with small twigs. Prayer too was a form of labor, a spiritual work done in hope and in desperation. A family with nothing might still have someone at the window, whispering to God as snow whispered against the glass. Roles weren't always chosen. They were inherited, handed down, or forced by circumstance. If a father died, the eldest son, perhaps only 12, took up the mantle. If a mother fell ill, daughters barely into adolescence took over the kitchen. There was no time for grief, no room for delay. The cold didn't wait for morning. It came whether your heart was ready or not. But within this system there was balance. Younger children learned by watching. Tasks were taught patiently by repetition and song. A toddler might be given a dull needle and scrap fabric, not to create anything but to learn the feel of work. Chores became rituals. Patterns formed. And slowly, as seasons passed, children became capable, and the cycle repeated. Winter was also a time for skill building. With fields frozen and travel limited, the indoors became a school of survival. Fathers carved wooden tools. Mothers taught weaving and mending. Older siblings showed the younger ones how to twist rope or set simple traps. In noble households, servants and apprentices trained under their masters, learning to bake, to smith, to keep records or serve meals properly. In some families, evenings became moments of quiet teaching. After the meal, by firelight, parents might share stories, not just to entertain but to pass on values, lessons, and warnings. Myths, fables, tales of saints or spirits. Warnings about wolves, witches, and wandering too far from the village. These weren't just bedtime stories. They were guidebooks for a dangerous world. Social roles were also present, especially in larger villages. The blacksmith's family mended tools. The coopers made barrels. The tanner's family prepared hides. Each family had a specialty, and winter made those specialties even more vital. The seamstress was needed more when cloaks tore. The healer was needed when someone fell ill. No family existed in total isolation. Even leisure had its place, though rarely as we know it. Leisure in winter meant moments of stillness. A carved toy passed from hand to hand. A game of knucklebones on the floor. A bit of song sung softly while spinning thread. These were luxuries not because they cost anything but because they cost time, and time was precious. And in all this the church loomed large. Religion gave rhythm to the weeks. Days of fasting, days of feasting. Prayers at dawn and dusk. The local priest might visit homes, bless food stores, or lead processions to pray for a mild spring. Everyone had their spiritual role, from the bell ringer to the choir boy. Even in the bleakest months, the church reminded people that suffering had meaning and warmth would return. In truth, these roles, so fixed, so demanding, gave a strange comfort. No one questioned their place. No one wondered what they were meant to be. They simply were. You woke each day knowing what to do. You worked, you helped, you hoped, and you prayed. That was life. And in the cold silence of winter, that certainty was a small kind of peace. Everyone mattered. Everyone contributed. Even the smallest act, a child wiping the table, a grandmother humming by the fire, was part of the great quiet labor of survival. And in that shared effort, in the constant motion of busy hands and shuffling feet, the warmth of human connection pushed back against the winter cold. In the heart of winter, with wind seeping through cracks in the walls and frost creeping along every wooden beam, survival didn't begin with a fire. It began with what you wore. For medieval peasants, clothing wasn't fashion, it was armor. Not against swords or arrows, but against the long, slow, bone-deep chill of winter. When the days were short and the nights bitter, the right layering could mean the difference between waking up with a cough and not waking up at all. There were no synthetic fibers. No fleece-lined jackets or thermal underwear. No waterproof boots or zippers. What they had was wool, scratchy, heavy, itchy, and absolutely essential. Wool retained warmth even when damp, a miracle trait in the misty chill of medieval winters. It was spun from sheep raised in the summer and woven by hand on looms that groaned under their own age. Entire families worked to shear, card, spin, and weave the fabric that would clothe them. Peasant clothing was simple. A man might wear a woolen tunic, belted at the waist, over a linen undershirt that hadn't been truly white in years. Beneath the tunic were woolen hose or leggings, sometimes wrapped with strips of cloth to seal in warmth. A cloak or mantle, often fastened with a wooden pin, was thrown over everything. If the wool was thick enough, it could block snow for a few hours. If it was thin, it became stiff and heavy when wet. Women wore long wool dresses with undergirdles made from coarse linen or flax. Their garments were often layered, 2 or 3 tunics thick, making movement slow but necessary. Aprons protected the outermost layer during chores, and cloaks helped trap body heat, though rarely as well as needed. Hoods, not hats, were common, and scarves or coifs covered their heads, ears, and sometimes even their mouths. Children wore miniature versions of adult clothing, though usually handed down and already threadbare. It wasn't uncommon for peasant children to own a single outfit that lasted the entire year, patched and adjusted as they grew. In wealthier homes, clothing might be more refined, more colorful, perhaps trimmed with decorative stitching or fur. But warmth was always the primary goal. Shoes were a struggle. Made from stitched leather, they were flat, thin, and offered little protection. A peasant's boot might keep out dry cold but not wet snow. They didn't have rubber soles or insulation, just hardened leather and a bit of hope. In some areas, people stuffed moss or straw into their shoes to cushion the foot and insulate against the chill. The straw would rot after a few days of use. But it worked. Barely. Those who couldn't afford proper shoes wrapped their feet in cloth, rags, or animal pelts. In the depths of winter, frostbite was a real threat. Toes blackened, feeling vanished, and walking became a painful shuffle. Peasants walked carefully on ice. One slip could mean a broken bone, which often meant death. Fur was rare but coveted. Fox, rabbit, and even squirrel pelts were stitched into collars, mittens, and sometimes linings for cloaks. Fur was better than wool at trapping heat, but also harder to clean and expensive to come by. Nobles, of course, had access to fur-lined everything: cloaks, boots, hats, and even undergarments. Peasants made do with scraps. And when clothing tore, you repaired it. Mending was a daily winter ritual. Sitting by candlelight or firelight, someone was always stitching. Women stitched men's sleeves, men patched their sons' hose, and older children helped wherever they could. Every hole was a weakness. Every tear let the cold in. And so, homes had baskets of thread, odd buttons, bits of fabric saved from years past, keepsakes not of sentiment but of necessity. Laundry in winter was a challenge. Water had to be heated by fire. Clothes were washed with lye soap, harsh on hands, harder on fabric, and dried near the hearth. But wet clothes froze easily, so people wore garments until they couldn't anymore. Smell was less important than survival. For nighttime, layers became lifelines. People slept fully clothed. Blankets were made of wool, heavy and rough, but effective. 2 or 3 layers, sometimes weighted down with cloaks or even animal hides. Beds were stuffed with straw or feathers if available, with children often sleeping top to toe under the same covers. The body heat of siblings was a warmer blessing than any fireplace. Bed curtains, if you had them, helped trap warmth in the sleeping area. And some wealthier peasants even slept near the hearth itself, just to feel the coal's dying warmth a little longer. And yet, despite their efforts, the cold got in. There were no heated floors. No hot water bottles. Just ingenuity, resilience, and tolerance built from necessity. Many kept stones by the fire, warming them before slipping them into beds. Some held cups of heated ale or cider, not for drinking but to thaw their fingers. Others swaddled babies in layers of linen and wool, wrapping them so tightly that only their noses peeked out, tiny faces against a world too cold to welcome them gently. Clothing then wasn't just fabric. It was a philosophy. It was passed down from mother to daughter, from father to son. A good cloak outlived its owner. A belt was passed between generations. A patch, sewn by candlelight, told stories of hardship and love. You didn't choose what to wear. You wore what had survived. And in those threadbare sleeves, frostbitten boots, and stiff wool hoods was a quiet declaration. We are still here. The wind may howl. The snow may fall. But as long as we can layer our bodies and warm our bones, we endure. In the heart of winter, when wood was low, bellies were light, and the wind howled through the rafters like a ghost looking for warmth, there was one thing every medieval peasant knew with certainty: you do not survive alone. The Middle Ages were brutal, not just because of disease, hunger, or cold, but because of how little margin there was for error. A broken leg, a failed harvest, or a collapsed roof could mean ruin. No one had extra. No one had savings or backup plans. But what they had, more often than not, was each other. Medieval communities were small, close-knit, and deeply interdependent. Villages might be just a cluster of cottages, a church, a mill, and a few outbuildings. Every person was known, every face familiar. There was no hiding in anonymity. And that was precisely what made support possible. You were seen. Your needs were known, sometimes before you voiced them. During winter, this closeness became the glue that kept villages from falling apart. If your cow died in December, neighbors might share milk from theirs. If your roof collapsed under snow, the village men would gather, patch it, and get it sealed before nightfall. Not because they had spare time, but because they knew one day it could be them. Bartering wasn't just economic. It was relational. A family with extra eggs might trade them for firewood. Someone with skill in mending shoes might fix a neighbor's boot in exchange for a pouch of dried beans. It wasn't always fair or formal. But it worked, because the goal wasn't profit. The goal was mutual endurance. The church played a central role in this network. It wasn't just a place of worship, it was the beating heart of social life. Parish priests knew who had fallen ill, who had lost a child, who had nothing left to burn. They'd organize food drives, distribute alms, or gently prod wealthier villagers to offer help to the poor. On feast days and holy days, food was sometimes prepared for the entire village, a way to share warmth when there was so little to go around. Children learned early that sharing wasn't optional, it was expected. If a friend had no mittens, you lent yours. If someone's doll had broken, you gave them straw to make a new one. And when bread was baked, an extra piece was set aside, not just for guests but for those who might appear hungry at the door. Even in the darkest nights, the hearth was never truly private. Doors were often open to neighbors and kin. If a traveler arrived late and cold, someone would find them a place to sleep, even if it meant squeezing 3 to a straw-stuffed mattress. The idea that warmth belonged to one family alone was foreign. Warmth, like bread or prayer, was meant to be shared. And when death came, as it often did in winter, the village mourned together. Women helped wash the body. Men dug the grave even through frozen ground. Children were kept close, not hidden from grief but taught how to face it gently. The funeral was a communal ritual, a reminder that even in loss you were not alone. But community support wasn't always organized or overt. It was also found in the quiet gestures. A neighbor slipping a bundle of kindling onto your doorstep at dawn. A midwife walking 2 miles through snow to check on a pregnant girl. A boy offering half his turnip at supper just because he saw your bowl was empty. These weren't dramatic moments, they were life-giving threads in the tapestry of survival. When families couldn't afford to feed their children, sometimes they were sent to live with relatives or wealthier villagers for the winter. It wasn't abandonment, it was trust. A quiet contract: keep my child warm, keep her fed, and I will owe you the rest of my days. In noble households, though the social gap was immense, lords and ladies often had a feudal obligation to care for their peasants, if only to ensure they had healthy workers come spring. Charity might be given during Christmas or Candlemas, when meat, bread, and ale were distributed among the poorest. Not out of pure kindness always, but because a village emptied by hunger served no one. And even within peasant homes, support extended beyond bloodlines. Elderly widows might live with neighbors. Orphans were often folded into other families without formal adoption. There were no social workers, no forms to fill out, just instinct and a shared understanding. No one should freeze alone. In some villages, rotating care was practiced. If one household had firewood, another might offer food, a third might supply warm clothing. The burden of survival was passed around like a hot stone in cold hands, each person holding it just long enough before giving it to the next. Craft guilds in larger towns practiced alms funds, pooling money to help sick or injured members. Rural parishes collected a small amount of grain or coins each month to create a communal reserve. And in times of true famine, entire communities would fast together, stretch rations, and pray as one. Even the act of prayer became communal, a circle of hope in the snow. This web of support didn't eliminate suffering, but it softened it. It reminded people they were not just individuals scraping by. They were part of something bigger, a body of souls moving through hardship together. And in that unity they found strength. So when the wind rattled the windows and the night pressed in like a heavy hand, medieval peasants did not rely on solitude. They relied on the knock at the door, the extra slice of bread, the quiet voice asking, "Do you need anything?" Because in that world, survival wasn't just about warmth or food. It was about belonging. And no matter how cold the night, no one should feel forgotten. As the sun dipped below the horizon and the long shadows of winter stretched like fingers across the snow-laden fields, medieval peasants prepared for the most uncertain part of their day, the night. Nightfall in the Middle Ages wasn't just darkness. It was a transition, a hush over the land, a soft warning that the world beyond the cottage door no longer belonged to man. It belonged to beasts, to spirits, to cold, to silence. And so, people turned inward, not just into their homes but into themselves. By the time dusk arrived, most of the day's work had already been done. The animals were fed, the firewood stacked, the meals prepared or eaten. The light from the small windows, already faint and filtered through sheets of animal horn or greased parchment, disappeared entirely. The hearth took center stage. It was the sun of the home, the single flame that guided every nighttime rhythm. The last coals were stirred. If there was bread left over, it was wrapped in cloth and hung from the rafters. Tools were cleaned, boots removed, cloaks shaken free of frost and snow. Every movement was slow. Not lazy, measured, deliberate. Nighttime was not for haste. Haste broke things. And broken things didn't get replaced. Peasant homes were small, often a single room with a packed earth floor, rough plank walls, and a thatched roof that might let in snow if the wind was right. But somehow that little space became a sanctuary. A kingdom lit by firelight and filled with voices. Before sleep, families gathered. Sometimes to eat if supper hadn't been taken earlier. Often just to talk. Not loud, raucous speech, but soft voices, echoes of the day. A mother asking if the hens laid, a father commenting on the weather. Children nestled near the fire, nodding off mid-sentence, heads on siblings' shoulders. There might be song too. Simple lullabies, hymns, or folk tunes carried down through generations. Not sung for entertainment but for grounding, for reminding the family of their roots, their resilience, their humanity. In some homes, prayers followed, soft, whispered words to saints and angels, asking for protection, for warmth, for the mercy of another day. Even storytelling had its sacred space. The oldest member of the family might begin, slowly, in a voice raspy with smoke and time. Tales of old kings, of cunning foxes, of trickster spirits who lived in wells and trees. These stories weren't just for children. They were community memory, oral maps of values, fears, hopes. A tale of a knight and a dragon might teach bravery. One of a starving woman who outwitted the devil might remind listeners to keep their faith. These weren't Disney endings. Heroes often failed. Villains triumphed. Warnings were given. Realism lived in these tales, wrapped in metaphor and moss. Once storytelling ended, or simply faded into silence, came the business of preparing for bed. Beds were communal. Privacy didn't exist. Families slept together, lined up like spoons, sometimes with guests or even animals nestled in for warmth. Straw mattresses were flattened and restuffed. Woolen blankets, thin, worn but better than nothing, were pulled tight. Everyone wore their daytime clothes to bed, adding extra socks or wrapping scarves around heads. The fire was banked, not extinguished but tamped down so that a faint glow might still smolder come morning. The last thing anyone wanted was to wake to a frozen house and a hearth that needed rekindling from scratch. And if there was no firewood left, people simply huddled tighter. Sleep in winter came in two parts. Historians call it first sleep and second sleep. After sunset, peasants would fall into deep slumber for a few hours, then wake in the middle of the night, not with panic but with routine. This wakeful period might be used to stoke the fire, pray, talk quietly, or even share a private moment with a spouse. Then came second sleep, softer, lighter, drifting into dawn. But night didn't always mean rest. Fear was part of sleep. Fear of wolves prowling at the edge of the village. Of thieves, spirits, or ill omens. The dark carried things the light couldn't explain. Many homes hung small charms above beds, twisted straw dolls, iron nails, bits of dried herbs, to ward off nightmares or worse. Some placed bowls of water near the threshold to confuse wandering spirits. Doors were bolted, not with locks but with heavy beams or stacked barrels. And yet, night had its tenderness too. A mother wrapping her infant tighter and singing to keep herself calm. A father rising in the dark to check the roof after hearing creaking under snow. A grandparent whispering a blessing over each sleeping child. These moments weren't grand, they were quiet acts of love in a world that offered so little safety. Outside, the snow blanketed everything. The fields, once full of life, were now hushed, covered, sleeping. The trees stood like sentinels, bare and brave. Wolves howled in the distance. The cold crept under doors, tapped at windows, settled on the thatch. But inside there was warmth, not just from fire but from flesh, breath, presence. The warmth of knowing your daughter's toes were tucked into your shins. Of hearing your son breathe beside you. Of feeling the weight of your home, however humble, still standing, still holding. Night rituals were survival rituals. They were hope dressed in habit. Each one a signal to the universe. We made it through the day. We are still here. Let us wake again. And when morning finally came, if it came softly. Not with alarm clocks or sunbursts. But with the gradual awareness that you were alive. That the cold had not taken you. That there was bread left and maybe tea. That you had, for one more night, endured. As winter's grip tightened on the medieval world, when the skies hung heavy and low, and breath turned to smoke before the lips, another kind of cold took hold, not the one that bit at your skin, but the one that stirred behind your eyes. The fear of the unknown. And in the Middle Ages the unknown wasn't a mystery, it was everywhere. In every creaking beam. Every gust of wind. Every shadow cast by candlelight. This fear didn't live in logic. It lived in superstition. You see, for medieval peasants, the world was not split between the natural and the supernatural. It was one and the same. God was watching. So were the saints. But so too were the spirits, the witches, the elves, the demons that danced just out of sight. And in winter they were closest, hungriest, waiting. Long nights and cold winds gave imagination fertile ground. The woods beyond the village weren't just filled with wolves, they were believed to be home to ancient things. The wild hunt, a ghostly procession of souls and gods, was said to sweep through forests in the deepest nights, collecting the unbaptized, the cursed, and the lost. If you heard horses' hooves pounding and dogs howling on a stormy night, you did not peek through the shutters. You prayed and you stayed silent. Every region had its own fears. In some parts of Europe, winter nights brought the Perkta, a pale, witch-like figure who visited homes to reward the industrious and punish the lazy. If you hadn't spun enough flax or swept your floor before 12th night, she might slit your belly open and stuff it with straw. Mothers told children not just to behave but to be thorough, because Perkta was watching. Other households feared elves or brownies, small household spirits that could bring good luck or misfortune depending on how they were treated. A bowl of milk left on the hearth, a crust of bread near the doorway, small offerings meant to keep these tricksters happy. Forget to leave them something and you might find your tools broken, your butter curdled, your chickens silent. But not all spirits were mischievous. Some were mournful, protective. Lost loved ones were believed to return in winter, drawn to the warmth of the living. That's why candles were left burning overnight, why doors were sometimes left slightly ajar. An invitation not for the living but for the dead who remembered home. Dreams carried meaning. If you dreamed of crows, someone might die. If you dreamed of snow falling inside your house, it meant a guest was bringing misfortune. And if you dreamed of clear skies during a storm, well, someone had hidden a lie and it would soon be revealed. Symbols mattered. Salt was sacred, not just for flavor or preservation but for protection. A circle of salt around a cradle kept spirits away. A sprinkle in the corners of the house warded off evil. Iron was powerful too. Hanging iron scissors above a baby's bed, or placing a horseshoe over the doorway, was said to repel witches and fairies. No one quite knew why it worked, only that it did. And then there was the evil eye, a glance believed to curse crops, dry up cows, or make children sick. People wore amulets, charms, or simply avoided boasting out loud for fear of drawing jealousy. Compliments were often followed by a gesture or a quick prayer, just to make sure they didn't turn into hexes. Holy days in winter, Christmas, Candlemas, Epiphany, weren't just celebrations. They were turning points, markers in time when the veil between worlds grew thin. People believed spirits were more active during the 12 days of Christmas. Tools were put away. Loud noises were discouraged. The best food was cooked, not just for guests but for unseen eyes watching from the rafters. Even chores had superstition. You didn't spin wool after dark. You didn't sweep the house between Christmas and New Year's, it might sweep out your luck. Whistling indoors was discouraged as it was thought to invite demons. And if the fire went out in the middle of the night, it was more than an inconvenience. It was a sign that something unnatural had passed through. When babies were born in winter, especially during storms, great care was taken. Midwives whispered prayers during labor. If the child was weak or sickly, it might be a changeling, a fairy child swapped for the real one. Iron scissors near the cradle or a father placing his coat over the infant were among the methods used to protect the newborn soul. Witchcraft was feared but also sought after. People visited cunning folk, wise women or men, who understood herbs, charms, and the old ways. They might offer protection spells, healing tinctures, or guidance through dark dreams. Most villages had at least one such figure. Feared, respected, visited at dusk. And above all else there was prayer. Superstition never replaced religion. It lived beside it. Crosses were carved into doors. Ashes from Palm Sunday were kept in pouches to ward off bad luck. If a storm raged outside, people knelt and prayed to Saint Barbara or St. Nicholas. The saints were seen as protectors, powerful, watchful, but needing to be honored. And perhaps most telling of all, when someone sneezed, those around them would murmur, "God bless you." Not out of politeness but out of belief. That the sneeze had opened a window to the soul, and something could slip in if you didn't guard it with a blessing. These rituals, these tiny gestures, these whispered phrases in the cold, they were anchors. They gave people a sense of control in a world where control was an illusion. Where crops failed, fires died, and illness came without warning. Superstitions weren't just beliefs. They were acts of hope, dressed in fear. And though we may smile now at tales of witches and spirits and salted doorways, they meant something. They gave shape to chaos. They turned the terrifying unknown into something just slightly more manageable. So when the wind rattled the shutters and the dark pressed hard against the door, a peasant didn't simply wait for morning. They lit a candle. They whispered a charm. They touched iron. They did what they could. Because in winter, in the Middle Ages, sometimes the only thing standing between you and despair was belief. Not every winter night in the Middle Ages was soaked in sorrow or shivering silence. For all its hardship, medieval life, especially in the frozen months, held space for laughter, play, and escape. Even the poorest villagers, buried under snow and burdened by toil, carved out moments of joy like secret treasures in a bleak season. Because they had to. When the fields lay sleeping and the work was paused by frost, people needed something more than survival. They needed something to lift their hearts, however briefly, above the biting cold and the heavy hunger. So they turned to what they had: songs, stories, games, and togetherness. In the long, dark evenings after chores were done and the fire burned low, families often turned to storytelling, the oldest form of entertainment. These were not just tales of knights and dragons, but also jokes, riddles, fables, and memories of ancestors long gone. Every family had its own storyteller, sometimes a grandfather with a slow, deliberate voice, or a mother who could slip into different characters mid-sentence. And the stories were not passive. They invited participation. Children asked questions. Adults chimed in with corrections or their own versions. It wasn't about accuracy, it was about keeping memory alive, about laughing or gasping together, about momentarily stepping outside of their cold, crowded world and into a universe where anything was possible. Sometimes, a wandering minstrel or bard would visit a village. Not often, perhaps once in a season. But when they did, the entire community gathered. People brought whatever they had, pieces of bread, a scrap of dried meat, to share. The bard would sit by the fire and spin long sagas in poetic form, often to the strum of a lute or lyre. These were the moments children remembered into adulthood. The night the storyteller came, and for a few hours, the entire village was suspended in wonder. But even without visitors, villages knew how to entertain themselves. Singing was common. Hymns, drinking songs, folk tunes. Songs sung while mending clothes, chopping vegetables, or brushing snow off shoes. Some were call and response, others were solo laments of lost love or hard winters. The melodies were simple, catchy enough for anyone to join even if they had no ear for pitch. And then, of course, there were games. Board games like Nine Men's Morris or Alkirk were carved into tabletops or wooden boards, played with pebbles or beans. Dice games were popular too, though often frowned upon by clergy, as they were linked to gambling and temptation. Children played with rag dolls, hoops, or small carved animals. Even snow itself became a toy, used for snowballs, sledding, or crude snowmen built beside the animal pens. When it was too cold outside for even the bravest child, games were played indoors. Simple ones like knucklebones, which used small bones from sheep or goats, or blind man's bluff, which left everyone giggling despite the confined space. And for adults, there were tales of mischief, impersonations of village elders, or mock debates where someone pretended to be the king and others had to petition them for a favor. These improvisations, part roast, part theater, offered both comic relief and a chance to poke fun at the structures that ruled their lives, if only behind closed doors. The church calendar also offered brief bursts of festivity. Even the poorest villages marked feast days, especially around Christmas and Epiphany. These were more than religious observances. They were the sanctioned times for food, song, and sometimes even reversal of roles. On days like Feast of Fools or Twelfth Night, peasants might elect a mock bishop or lord of misrule, often a local prankster who led parades, jokes, and light-hearted chaos. Priests turned a blind eye, if only for a day, as villagers drank weak ale, wore masks, danced in circles, and gave themselves over to absurdity. Such rituals didn't just entertain, they relieved pressure. In a world where control and obedience were expected, laughter became resistance. Silly songs became safety valves. Foolishness became freedom. And there was music, always music. Even if the village had no official musicians, someone would know how to beat a drum, pluck a string, or whistle through carved reeds. The tunes echoed through thatched cottages and stone halls alike. Feet tapped on dirt floors. Infants giggled in the arms of sisters. Old men closed their eyes and let the sound pull them backward, to better days or at least to warmer ones. Sometimes these evenings turned romantic. In winter, betrothals were often made, not because love bloomed more easily, but because the downtime allowed families to talk, to plan, to visit. A pair of young villagers might exchange woolen gloves as a promise. They might share whispered songs by the fire, or sneak an extra bowl of stew to one another. Love was not grand in these moments. It was quiet, secret. A shared smile during prayer. A helping hand with the spinning wheel. Even dreams became a form of entertainment. People would share their dreams aloud in the morning, especially during the 12 days of Christmas when dreams were thought to be prophetic. Families might try to interpret them. Was that black dog in your dream a warning? Was the frozen lake a sign of loss or rebirth? Books were rare. Reading even rarer. But oral tradition filled the gap. Villages had their own histories, passed down mouth to mouth like ancient spells. Stories of great floods, haunted woods, saintly miracles, and wars that once sent fire across the fields. Each tale grew a little taller each winter, but no one minded. Exaggeration was part of the fun. And above all, there was togetherness. In modern times, we often picture joy as loud, extravagant. In medieval times, joy was intimate, sparse, but treasured. It was the hush after a shared joke. The comfort of your brother's head on your shoulder. The sound of your mother singing while mending your sleeve. It was a candle that didn't go out. A stew that stretched to feed one more. A song remembered just when the silence had grown too heavy. Because when the snows fell thick and the nights stretched long, entertainment wasn't just about passing the time. It was about defying the dark. In the frigid grip of winter, when fields were barren and the wind sang lonely songs through the trees, medieval peasants did not face the season alone. They had animals. Not pets, not mascots, but companions, co-survivors, and in many ways silent partners in the daily struggle against the cold. The bond between people and animals in the Middle Ages was not sentimental, but it was deeply rooted. Animals were essential to survival, providing warmth, food, labor, and at times, a kind of comfort that no spoken word could match. And in the heart of winter, that relationship became more intimate than ever. Step inside a peasant's cottage and you would not find it empty of life. Chickens might roost in the corner. A goat could be tied near the hearth. Cows, sheep, pigs, small ones, were often brought inside at night, especially during deep frost or snow. The animal's body heat helped warm the home. In turn, the humans protected them from the elements. You might imagine it chaotic, even filthy. But to a medieval family, this mingling of species was normal. Familiar. It was the sound of a calf snorting softly in its sleep. The rustle of feathers as hens shifted on the rafters. The quiet snoring of a dog curled near the fire. A living lullaby in a world that offered little else. Every animal had its role. The ox, the medieval tractor. Slow, heavy, tireless. It pulled the plows that carved the land and the carts that carried harvests. In winter, the ox rested, fed carefully on hay that had been dried and stored months before. If the hay ran low, the family suffered along with it. Because without the ox, spring planting would be impossible. Pigs were perhaps the most practical animal. Hardy, adaptable, they foraged in warmer seasons and fattened quickly. In late autumn, before the full brunt of winter, pigs were often slaughtered. Their meat was salted, smoked, or dried to last through the dark months. But one or two were sometimes kept alive, huddled in pens, fed scraps, and protected from the chill. If they survived until spring, they could birth the next generation of food. Sheep offered more than mutton. Their wool was lifeblood. Sheared in spring and spun through summer, it became the clothes that kept families warm through blizzards and frostbite. Even in winter, the sheep were guarded carefully, kept dry, kept fed. Their buying was a constant reminder that beneath hardship, there was future comfort. Goats gave milk when cows dried up. They were clever, stubborn, and hardy, able to survive on weeds, bark, and scraps. A peasant child might be charged with watching over the goats, leading them out when weather allowed, or hand-feeding them during snowfalls. The bond between a boy and his goat was not quaint, it was survival stitched with affection. Dogs served as guards and hunters. But they were also one of the few animals allowed real closeness. A dog might sleep at the foot of the family's shared bed, alert for wolves or thieves. It might curl against a toddler for warmth. Dogs learned the rhythms of human life, when to sit still, when to beg for bones, when to leap barking at the unseen. Cats too earned their place, not through loyalty but through efficiency. They patrolled homes and barns, keeping rats and mice away from grain stores. In an age without pesticides or sealed containers, a single cat could protect a family's food supply. They moved like shadows, rarely pampered but rarely chased off. Some were even given names, treated with a quiet respect that hovered between superstition and trust. In monasteries and manors, horses lived in stables and were fed grain even during scarcity. But in villages, horses were rare. Too expensive. Too much to feed. The peasants leaned on donkeys and ponies, low-maintenance beasts who could carry firewood, pull sleds, or even transport a sick neighbor to a nearby hamlet. In winter they too were brought in close, their breath mingling with that of their keepers. But animals weren't just tools. In the dead of winter they became a source of life in a lifeless landscape. When the world outside was white and still, a rooster's crow brought reassurance. A calf's wobbling steps gave a child something to smile about. A hen's unexpected egg was a miracle, golden and warm in a numb palm. And in death, animals gave everything. Meat, bones for tools, fat for tallow candles, hides for clothes and boots. Even bladders were used as containers, intestines as strings for instruments, hooves boiled for glue. Nothing was wasted. Every animal that fed the family also clothed it, warmed it, and lit its nights. Peasants knew their animals by sight, by sound, by soul. A cow that refused to eat might signal a storm. A dog's whine might mean strangers were near. A ewe giving birth in the cold needed immediate help, lest both lamb and mother perish. This wasn't just farming, it was attunement. A quiet, mutual understanding built not from affection alone, but from years of shared hardship. Superstitions surrounded animals too. Black cats were seen with suspicion, yet often spared because of their mousing prowess. A cow that refused to give milk might be cursed. Some believed that witches could steal milk from cows at night, and so families hung iron charms in barns or whispered blessings over teats. Horseshoes over doors not just for luck but to ward off evil, an acknowledgement that animals like humans needed spiritual protection. Animals also featured in dreams and omens. Seeing a fox in the morning meant bad luck. An owl's call at dusk foretold death. If your dog howled at the sky, some whispered it could see the souls of the departed. These beliefs weren't always spoken aloud, but they shaped behavior, seeded caution, taught reverence. And yet there were moments of beauty. A child feeding a lamb from a cloth-wrapped bottle. A farmer stroking his cow's neck after a long milking. A dog resting its chin on the foot of a sleeping girl. Moments unnoticed by the church, unrecorded by scribes. But real. Tender. The kind of warmth that no hearth could provide. Because in winter, survival was not just about fire and food. It was about connection, to the land, to the family, and to the animals who shared your breath, your space, your fate. When the wind screamed through the thatch and the nights felt too long to bear, you listened not just for human voices, but for the soft sounds of life beside you. A bleat, a snore, a scratch, a reminder, you were not alone. Winter in medieval times was not just a test of endurance against the cold, it was a gauntlet of illness, a season of coughing, fever, and quiet dread. In the modern world we reach for pills, heaters, and hospitals. But in the Middle Ages, when medicine was primitive and physicians few and far between, survival depended on improvisation, superstition, and ancient rituals passed from grandmother to granddaughter, monk to novice. When a child's breath rasped in the dark, when the father coughed blood into a cloth, when the joints of the old woman stiffened like ice, what did they do? They turned to what they had. A peasant's medicine cabinet was not a shelf of glass bottles, but a bundle of dried herbs tied with string hung from beams, or stored in old pots beside the hearth. Mugwort, comfrey, yarrow, chamomile, nettle. Their names were whispered like spells. Each plant carried centuries of lore. Some worked, others didn't. But when a person had nothing else, a handful of leaves and a prayer were better than silence. A sore throat? Gargle with vinegar boiled with sage. A cough? Steep thyme in weak beer and drink it hot. Joint pain? Mash garlic into lard and rub it into the skin. Honey, when it could be spared, was treasured, not just for sweetness but for healing. It was used in salves, smeared on wounds, stirred into hot drinks. Medieval people didn't know it was antibacterial. They only knew it helped, and that was enough. And garlic, not just a seasoning but a cornerstone of folk healing. Eaten raw for colds. Worn in necklaces to ward off plague. buried at thresholds to keep illness from crossing into the home. The smell of garlic in winter was the smell of hope, strong and stubborn. When fever struck, families tried to draw out the heat. Cold cloths soaked in vinegar were placed on the forehead. Sweating rituals, wrapping the patient in layers of wool with hot stones under the bed, tried to drive illness out through the skin. And when none of it worked, there was prayer. Many illnesses were believed to come from imbalances of the four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Too much phlegm made you sluggish. Too much black bile brought sadness. A medieval healer might recommend bleeding, purging, or fasting to bring the body back into balance. Leeches were placed on the skin to cleanse the blood. Boiled mixtures of herbs, oil, and wine were prescribed not by knowledge, but by tradition. In monasteries, medicine was a mix of learning and mysticism. Monks kept herb gardens and copied medical texts from ancient Greece and Rome. Their remedies were more systematic: lavender for restlessness, fennel for digestion, betony for headaches. Some monasteries even kept hospitals of sorts, cleaner than the average home, with dedicated rooms and shared straw beds. But for the average villager, monks were distant figures. Their healing came not from books, but from the old woman at the edge of the village, the one who knew the plants and the moon phases, who had delivered babies and buried husbands, who carried 100 winters in her spine and more wisdom than any bishop. And then came the superstitions, woven tightly with medicine, impossible to separate. To cure a fever, a piece of your clothing might be tied to a tree at the crossroads. To stop a nosebleed, a charm might be whispered into water and splashed over your face. To avoid the plague, you carried posies of herbs in your sleeves and recited Psalm 91 aloud every morning. To treat madness, a healer might burn the fur of a black dog and scatter its ashes in wine. It sounds absurd now. But remember, they didn't know what we know. They didn't understand bacteria, viruses, or even hygiene. So they used what they could see, smell, taste, and trust. The rustle of herbs, the heat of stone, the shape of the moon. And always they watched the skies. The stars guided not only farming but healing. A wound bled more under Mars. A cure made on a waning moon worked faster. Certain days of the month were more open to healing. Others were dangerous. Even common foods became medicine in winter. Warm ale, mulled with spices, was used to open the chest. Porridge, rich with garlic and onions, was a morning ritual for strength. Bone broth, simmered for hours, gave both nutrition and comfort. Apples, dried and rehydrated, were steeped with honey for sore bellies. But even with all these attempts, many illnesses simply could not be cured. Pneumonia, tuberculosis, diphtheria, typhus. They moved silently through homes, taking children and the old first, then sometimes the strongest. There were no antibiotics, no cough syrup, no hospitals with warm beds and blinking monitors. There was only the fire, the family, and the fading breath of someone you loved. And in those moments, medicine became ritual. Candles were lit. Hands were held. Prayers spoken over still bodies. Coins placed over eyes. Bodies wrapped in linen. Laid out by the hearth until burial. Sometimes they waited days for the ground to thaw. Grief was not hidden. It sat at the table. It slept on the floor. It sang low, broken songs at night when no one else could sleep. But even grief was managed with ritual. When someone died of illness, cleansing was essential. The bed was stripped and burned, the hearth re-blessed, herbs scattered across the floor and swept into the fire. Not out of science but out of deep fear, of the soul lingering, of the sickness returning. And still life went on. A baby would cry. A cough would ease. A widow would bake bread again. People adapted. Because they had to. And slowly, with the slow return of spring, health returned too. The sun warmed the bones. The earth gave its first greens. The air smelled of life instead of smoke. And those who survived, fragile, weathered, wiser, counted each breath like treasure. Because they knew something we often forget. That every breath is borrowed and winter asks for it back one day. As the long medieval nights deepened and frost painted the world in silence, people turned inward, to their homes, their hearths, and most of all to their faith. Winter wasn't just a physical trial, it was a spiritual reckoning. A time when the veil between life and death felt thinnest. When people believed that forces, both divine and dark, moved more freely through the world. And so, to survive the winter, medieval peasants did not rely only on fire and food. They relied on God, on saints, on charms, blessings, and rituals passed down like sacred heirlooms. Their faith wasn't passive, it was woven into every part of their day. Mornings began not with alarm clocks but with whispered prayers. The sign of the cross was made over bread before it was eaten. Children were taught to recite the Lord's Prayer before stepping outside, especially on days when the sky looked unfriendly. Church bells, faint but familiar, marked the rhythm of the day, matins before dawn, vespers at twilight, compline before bed. Even in the coldest months, villagers wrapped themselves in wool and trudged through snow to attend Massachusetts. Not just out of duty, but because they believed that being in the presence of God made them safer. The village church stood at the heart of it all. Small, stone, often damp, its walls covered in faded paintings of saints and angels. The floors were cold, the benches hard, but the space held warmth of another kind. Oh, tradition. The belief that if God saw you, he might spare you. Saints were more than figures in stained glass. They were active guardians. Saint Apollonia was invoked for toothaches. Saint Sebastian for plague. Saint Bridget for hearth and home. Saint Nicholas, long before he became Santa Claus, was protector of children. Families kept small icons or relics if they could afford them. A vial of holy water. A splinter of wood said to be from a saint's tomb. Even just a blessed piece of cloth. These were hung near beds, tucked under pillows, tied around babies' wrists, spiritual armor for dark times. The winter solstice, the longest night of the year, was a fearful moment. Many believed it was when evil spirits were most active. In some villages, people stayed indoors that entire night, placing candles in every window and drawing symbols and chalk on the doors to ward off spirits. Crosses, circles, or the initials of the three wise men, C+M+B, Casper, Melchior, Balthazar. They lit fires not only for warmth but to keep darkness itself at bay. Certain nights had special weight. Christmas Eve was not just about celebration, it was a spiritual turning point. The birth of Christ was a promise that even in the coldest, darkest moment, light would return. It was no coincidence that this holy day came just after the solstice. A divine reassurance that the world would warm again. The Yule log, burned on Christmas night, was not just tradition. It was ritual. A sacred piece of wood, sometimes carved with symbols, sometimes blessed, placed in the hearth to burn through the night. Ashes from the Yule log were often kept, believed to bring protection against lightning and misfortune. But winter wasn't all angels and bells. There was fear too. Fear of the wild hunt, ghostly riders sweeping through the skies. Fear of witches who could steal your warmth, your crops, your sleep. Fear of curses cast by jealous neighbors or old rivals. To guard against these, villagers used charms. Garlic hung in doorways. Iron nails placed under thresholds. Salt sprinkled in corners of rooms. The threshold was a sacred boundary. Many believed spirits could only enter if invited, so windows were shuttered tight and doors marked with protective signs. Babies were not left alone, and animals were blessed with prayers during the feast of Saint Anthony. And then there were the miracles, or what passed for them. A candle that wouldn't blow out in the wind. A loaf of bread that fed more than it should have. A stranger appearing in the snow and disappearing just as suddenly. Stories like these were told around the fire, soft and reverent. Not to boast, but to remind, God is watching. And sometimes, he reaches down even to the poorest of peasants. In monasteries, monks kept vigil during winter feasts, chanting psalms through the night, praying not only for themselves but for the world, for the sick, the hungry, the lost. Their voices, echoing through stone halls, were believed to strengthen the spiritual shield over the land. Pilgrimages were rare in winter but not unheard of. Some desperate souls walked miles through snow to visit a holy relic. A bleeding statue. A healing well. A shrine said to answer prayers. For these people, faith wasn't abstract. It was embodied. Touched, tasted, breathed. And at the heart of it all was the home altar. It might be just a shelf with a cross and a single candle. or a more elaborate corner with icons, beads, and scripture. Every night, candles were lit. Shadows danced. Prayers were whispered. Not long, not loud. Just enough to say, "We are still here. We are still trying." Even funerals in winter were acts of defiance. Digging through frozen ground. Carrying the dead wrapped in cloth, not caskets. Singing psalms with cracked voices. Not because they expected the dead to hear, but because the living needed to remember that even death was not the end. Because behind every prayer, every blessing, every crumb left for a saint or spirit, was one deep, ancient truth. They believed. They believed that the world was more than what it seemed. That suffering was not meaningless. That someone was watching. And that spring would come. Faith gave shape to their struggle. Meaning to their misery. And when all else failed, when the fire died and the food was gone, faith was what stayed. Even in the hardest winters, when snow blanketed the earth and breath fogged the air like ghosts, medieval peasants did not live entirely without joy. In fact, some of the most spirited, warm-hearted celebrations occurred in the very heart of winter, the season of hunger, cold, and darkness. Because for those who had little, joy wasn't just a luxury. It was a necessity, a rebellion, a way to say, "We are still alive." And nowhere did this joy burn brighter than during midwinter festivals. Let's begin with Christmas, though it wasn't quite the cozy, gift-laden holiday we know today. For most medieval people, it marked not consumerism, but community, ritual, and rare indulgence. The days leading up to Christmas, known as Advent, were a time of fasting and spiritual preparation. But once Christmas Day arrived, the feasting began. And it didn't last one day. It lasted 12. Yes, the 12 days of Christmas were real. From December 25th to January 6th, villages entered a sacred pause. Work was reduced. Ale flowed more freely. Fires burned a little longer. And for many, it was the only time of year they might taste meat, sweets, or spiced drinks. Goose if they were lucky. Mince pies sweetened with honey or dried fruits. Warm ale or weak mead heated with cloves, cinnamon, and herbs. It was a taste of warmth inside and out. Homes were decorated not with ornaments, but with greenery, holly, ivy, evergreen branches. These were symbols of life enduring through death, nature's promise that even the frozen world still carried a spark of green. Families would sing carols, not the polished tunes we hear today, but rowdy, earthy songs passed down orally. Songs with clapping, stomping, and laughter. Children learned the verses from their elders, singing about saints, miracles, and, often, comically exaggerated tales of drunken animals or bickering angels. And there was dancing. Even with sore feet and cold floors, dancing was a way to shake off the frost, to bring movement to still bodies and still spirits. A fiddler would play. A drummer might keep rhythm with pots or their own boots. Young couples danced in awkward circles. Elders tapped their knees and clapped. It didn't matter how it looked. It only mattered that they moved. The most beloved part of midwinter, though, was the festival of Twelfth Night, the final evening of Christmas, January 5th. It was the night of reversal, of mischief, of laughter turned up high. For this one night, peasants could play lords, and lords might feign servitude in jest. A lord of misrule was often chosen, a prankster or fool elected to lead games, jokes, and mock parades through the village. People wore masks, swapped clothes, sang bawdy songs without fear of punishment. Twelfth Night was the great exhale after 12 nights of hope. A final celebration before the long stretch of bleak January set in. And then came Epiphany, January 6th, marking the arrival of the Magi or three wise men in Christian tradition. This day was spiritual, yes, but also marked by gift-giving, typically modest, symbolic things. A carved charm, a ribbon, a sweet bun. Children especially were at the center of these celebrations. Though medieval childhood was brief, midwinter allowed them time to play, to receive tokens, and to be reminded they mattered. Games were organized in halls. Little plays were performed, nativity stories, miracle tales, even comical skits about talking animals or foolish kings. In some places wassailing took place. People would go door to door, offering to sing blessings in exchange for food or drink. It was part caroling, part pagan tradition, meant to drive out evil and invite prosperity into the home. A hot spiced drink called wassail, a mix of ale, honey, and apples, was shared from one large bowl. One sip warmed your throat. 2 sips made you brave enough to sing. The spirit of community ran deep through all of this. In winter, when life was at its hardest, people leaned on each other more than ever. If a neighbor's goat died, others might share their milk. If a family had no meat for Christmas, the village priest or the reeve might ensure they got some. Even among the poorest, there was often one small extra loaf, one ladle of stew, one blanket to lend. But midwinter joy wasn't only Christian. Older, pre-Christian traditions also lingered, quietly preserved by memory and repetition. The Yule log, for example, predates Christianity. It was burned not just for warmth but as a symbol of sun and protection. People would sing as they lit it, sometimes offering small tokens, herbs, bread, salt, into the fire as gifts to unseen spirits. Solstice night, the longest night of the year around December 21st, was still remembered in rural areas. Some believed that animals could speak at midnight. Others left bread out for house spirits. Fires were kept lit all night, not just for heat, but because people feared what the darkness might bring.
Bedtime stories.
In the far north and highlands,
how people
remnants of
explained the
older gods and
inexplicable.
spirits lingered.
Why did the cow
Beings
die?
of frost,
Why did the
mist,
fire
and
go
wood.
out? Why did
Parents
the
would
baby
warn
fall
children
ill?
not to wander
When
out at
science
night,
was unknown,
not just for
stories
fear of
filled the
wolves,
gap.
but for fear
But
of
they
the
weren't
cold
all
lady, the
terrifying.
snowman, or the
Some
midnight
told of
crone,
winter spirits
winter
who
spirits
protected,
who stole warmth
guardians
from the
who
foolish.
watched over the hearth if you treated them kindly. You left them a bowl of cream or a crust of bread. You swept your floor. You didn't speak harshly on solstice night. If you did, you'd wake up warm. Your fire still burning. Your dreams peaceful. And then, in quieter moments, midwinter joy took gentler forms. A child learning a song for the first time. A grandmother telling the story of how her father saw the sky dance with light. A wife stitching a surprise into her husband's worn tunic. A brother saving the last bite of pie for his younger sister. These were the quiet gifts, the ones without ribbon but heavy with love. By February, most of the festivals were over. The hard stretch returned. But those memories, those moments of warmth and song, carried people through. They gave meaning to the work ahead. They whispered in the coldest dawns, "You laughed once. You will laugh again." Because joy in winter wasn't just celebration. It was resistance. It was lighting a candle when the night says don't. It was dancing when your boots have holes. It was singing when your belly growls. It was knowing that no matter how hard the world gets, there is still room for joy. In a world without fleece, synthetic insulation, or electric heaters, surviving winter was about more than shelter and fire. It was about what you wore. For the medieval peasant, clothing wasn't fashion. It was armor. Against wind. Against frost. Against the biting cold that crept through stone walls and wooden beams, seeping into bones. Layer by layer, stitch by stitch, medieval people prepared their bodies for the long freeze. Each piece of clothing was functional, crafted not in factories but at home, by hand with care, often from wool, linen, and leather. Let's begin at the base. The first layer, worn closest to the skin, was a linen shift or shirt. For men this might be a long undershirt. For women a full-length chemise. Linen was valued because even in cold weather, it wicked away moisture. It kept the skin dry, and as anyone who's ever endured winter knows, dryness is warmth's best friend. But linen was not warm. It was the first line, not the last. Over this came wool. The medieval miracle fiber. Wool was everywhere. Homespun from village sheep, dyed with local plants, spun on drop spindles and woven on narrow looms. It was thick, heavy, sometimes scratchy. But in winter that itch meant survival. Men wore woolen tunics, long shirts reaching to the thigh or knee belted at the waist. Over that, a cloak or mantle, fastened at one shoulder with a pin or brooch. Women layered wool dresses over their chemises, sometimes with aprons or shawls. If they were fortunate, they had a surcoat, a sleeveless overdress lined with fur or thick cloth. Leg coverings were essential. Men wore hose, tight-fitting woolen leggings, often held up with ties or laces. These weren't stretchy like modern leggings. They were stiff and needed adjustment throughout the day. Women wore long wool skirts, which they lifted carefully to avoid dragging in slush. And then came the outer layers. Cloaks, capes, coats sewn from multiple layers. Often older clothes were recycled, cut apart, turned inside out, patched together into new garments. A peasant might wear a coat that had once been their grandfather's tunic, now quilted with scraps and stitched by candlelight. In colder regions fur was used, but it was rare and precious. Rabbits, squirrels, sometimes even cats. Fur was stitched into linings or added as trim to collars and cuffs. Not for decoration, but to protect the parts of the body most exposed to wind. Then there were the head coverings. The human body loses significant heat through the scalp. So medieval people always covered their heads indoors and out. Men wore woolen caps, often simple and snug. Women covered their hair with linen coifs, veils, or kerchiefs, and in winter, these were layered with woolen hoods that draped down over the shoulders like mini-capes. Children wore smaller versions of adult clothes. Sometimes looser with room to grow but no less layered. Their mothers would often stitch charms or prayers into the seams, believing that a thread looped with intention could keep cold and bad luck away. Then came the hands and feet, the most vulnerable to frost. Gloves were a luxury. Peasants used mittens, often made from leftover wool scraps. Some wore fingerless gloves to allow for work, holding tools, gripping reins, gathering firewood. Feet were wrapped in wool rags before being slipped into leather shoes, soft-soled, flat, with little protection against mud or snow. In deep winter, people stuffed straw or moss into their shoes for insulation. Not perfect but better than nothing. And every evening, shoes and foot wraps were dried by the fire, ready to be reworn the next day. A peasant might only own one pair of shoes their entire life, mended, stitched, and restitched again. Waterproofing didn't exist. If it rained or snowed, people got wet. They relied on cloaks treated with animal fat or wax to resist moisture. Capes made from felted wool or leather were prized in the wet months, especially those with hoods. Those with access to animal skins, sheepskin, goatskin, made pelisses or full winter coats lined entirely with fur. These were warm but heavy, and only the relatively well-off had them. For most, survival meant layering as much as possible, and hoping the fire lasted through the night. And speaking of night, sleeping attire wasn't what we imagine today. Most peasants slept fully dressed, with only boots and cloaks removed. Families huddled together and shared beds, using body heat as an essential layer. Blankets were rare, usually wool, coarse and patched. The wealthiest had feather beds. Everyone else had straw mattresses, stuffed into sacks and turned regularly to prevent rot. In colder months, people brought animals indoors at night. Chickens, goats, even pigs. Not just for protection but because every warm body made a difference. The smell was secondary to survival. And yet, through all this, layered and bundled, wrapped in scratchy cloth and stitched hope, people adapted. Mothers learned to spin wool finer and tighter. Fathers taught sons to repair boots with bone needles. Grandmothers handed down tips for softening cloth with lye or animal urine, unpleasant but effective. Each thread told a story. Each patch a memory. That square on your sleeve? That used to be part of your mother's wedding shawl. That tear on your cloak? It happened during the frost of '39, when you slipped on the ice fetching water. Clothing wasn't disposable. It was generational. And when someone died, their best garment was often buried with them. Not as vanity but as warmth for the soul on its journey. In the end, winter didn't just test the strength of your shelter. It tested your knowledge, your hands, your patience. Whether you could spin yarn tight enough. Whether you could stitch seam strong enough. Whether you could make one pair of mittens last through 3 seasons of bitter cold. But they did. And not because they had more. Because they made more out of less. They layered love, skill, and persistence into every seam. And so, when the winds howled and the snow beat down, they didn't shiver alone. They walked into winter wrapped in the quiet armor of survival, one stitch at a time. In the Middle Ages, the word preparedness didn't mean stocked pantries or emergency kits. It meant survival, crafted day by day with calloused hands, generational knowledge, and humble tools. There were no manuals, no YouTube tutorials, just memory, habit, and the whispered advice of elders whose wisdom had been tested by countless winters. Because in a peasant's life, skills were life. And tools weren't just things you owned. They were extensions of your hands, sometimes passed from grandfather to father to son. Sometimes made from scratch when no other option existed. The most important tools were simple. A knife always, small, sharp, versatile.
used for cutting meat, trimming thread, carving wood, repairing boots. A peasant's knife was like a modern multi-tool, used for everything from cooking to self-defense to prying ice from shutters. For those working the land, hoes, scythes, and sickles were essential. Though fields were frozen during winter, repairs still had to be made. Blades were resharpened, wood handles carved anew, iron heads reset. A winter spent mending tools was a summer saved from disaster. Axes came in many forms. Felling axes for chopping trees. Splitting axes for firewood. Hatchets for finer work. Every family had at least one, and it was often the most treasured possession in the household. Without wood there was no heat. Without heat there was no survival. Fire itself, so taken for granted today, was an art in the Middle Ages. Flint and steel were common. Striking them created sparks, but lighting a fire required skill. The spark had to catch on dry tinder, often charred cloth, birch bark, or dried moss, then carefully nursed into flame with twigs and breath. A single ember, fanned properly, could warm a room. Mishandled, it died, leaving cold and frustration. Because of this, fires were rarely allowed to die completely. Hearths were banked each night, covered in ash to keep the embers alive until morning. A warm hearth wasn't just comfort. It was continuity. And when fires failed, people shared. A neighbor might bring an ember in a covered pot. Or a burning stick, wrapped in cloth, passed carefully from door to door. Ropes and cords were another lifeline. Twisted from hemp, flax, or horsehair, they were used to tie down roofs, repair doors, bundle wood, suspend meats, lead animals. Knowing how to tie a good knot, or twist a new rope, could mean the difference between your roof surviving a blizzard or collapsing under snow. Then came needles, often carved from bone or shaped from metal. These weren't just for mending clothes. They were used for repairing bags, cloaks, shoes, even skin. A household might have only one or two needles, treasured like gold. When one broke, it was mourned. Grain mills, for those lucky enough to live near one, were complex but vital. But during winter, many ground their own flour at home using cornstones, two flat stones rotated by hand to grind grain. The process was slow, exhausting, and rough, often embedding tiny bits of stone into the flour. But it was better than hunger. In villages near water, ice was a tool in itself. Blocks of frozen river were sometimes cut and stored underground to preserve food longer. Snow was packed into cellars or outhouses to keep meats from spoiling. People knew how to use the cold, not just fight it. And then there were snares, traps, and fish lines, set quietly near woods or streams to catch small game when livestock feed was low. A rabbit caught in winter could mean meat for 2 days. A fish could provide vital protein. These tools required stealth, knowledge of animal habits, and patience born of desperation. Many homes had wooden spindles and drop whirls for spinning thread. Even in winter, people spun wool beside the fire, turning raw fleece into yarn and yarn into cloth. Children were taught early how to spin, how to weave, how to stitch. The sound of a spindle whirring was part of the evening rhythm. Then came baskets woven from willow or hazel. These were used to carry firewood, store grain, or hang food in rafters away from rats. Basket weaving was its own craft, and every bend of branch was learned by doing, not reading. Something broke, a tool, a pot, a latch, it was repaired, not discarded. Broken iron tools were taken to the local blacksmith, who worked even in winter, often with numb fingers and red cheeks from the forge. A peasant might trade eggs or cloth in exchange for a sharpened plow blade or a reforged axe. And when all else failed, people improvised. A broken pot might be patched with resin and twine. A hole in a boot filled with straw and stitched shut. A cracked window sealed with cloth and lard. Every item had a second life. And a third. Because in the medieval world, resilience wasn't a mindset, it was muscle memory. This winter self-reliance wasn't just about tools. It was also about knowing the rhythms of nature. Knowing when to collect firewood so the bark would split. Knowing which herbs grew under snow and where. Knowing how deep the frost reached into the earth and what that meant for spring planting. Knowing the sound of approaching ice in the river and when to move livestock inland. Knowing which stars marked the return of light. These were skills that could not be taught in one season or even one lifetime. They were passed down, quietly, carefully, from parent to child. Sometimes through stories. Sometimes through practice. Always through love. Because in winter, love was not just emotion. It was action. Sharpening your brother's blade. Mending your grandmother's cloak. Leaving out food for a neighbor whose cow died. Showing your daughter how to card wool not just for warmth but for her future family. The tools of survival were not just objects. They were acts of remembering, of belonging, of carrying old wisdom into cold nights. And when the snow came, thick and silent, and the world felt still, it wasn't fear that settled in. It was preparation. The quiet comfort of knowing your axe was sharp. Your cloak was patched. Your fire was ready. And your hands knew exactly what to do. In the medieval world, elders were the libraries. In villages without books, where parchment was rare and literacy rarer still, knowledge wasn't stored on pages, it was stored in people. And no one carried more of it than the old. These were men and women with bent backs and slow steps, whose faces told stories long before their lips ever moved. Their eyes had seen blizzards swallow whole fields, fires gut villages, and famine steal the laughter from children. Yet here they were, still breathing, still watching, still knowing. And their knowledge wasn't written down. It was woven into winter itself. The elders knew the signs. Not just the obvious ones like the color of the clouds or the smell in the wind. They noticed the way the mice built their nests, higher than usual this year, which meant a wetter season ahead. They felt the ache in their bones and said, "The frost is coming early." They watched the way the cows moved, the way the dogs slept, the shape of the moon in November. They could predict cold before it came because they had lived through so much of it. And they taught, quietly. Not in classrooms but by the hearth. By gesture. By correction. A grandmother guiding a child's hand through a stitch. A grandfather showing how to split wood so it would burn evenly through the night. No lectures, just repetitions. No praise, just patience. The old ones didn't rush. They knew winter didn't reward speed. Winter rewarded steadiness, caution, foresight. And so they passed that rhythm down, slow movements, measured actions. Every gesture had purpose. Every pause held wisdom. They told stories not for entertainment, but as instruction manuals disguised as tales. Once there was a man who planted barley too soon. Let me tell you what happened to the girl who ignored the moon signs. Remember when the river iced over in the year of the great frost? These stories were clocks, calendars, warnings. They told of winters when the grain ran out and families boiled tree bark to eat. Of years when disease came with the snow and only those who burned rosemary in their doorways stayed well. They told of love lost to frostbite. Of babies born in January who didn't survive. Of neighbors who shared their last candle and were blessed with warmth they couldn't explain. They remembered everything. The names of midwives from 40 years ago. The taste of rye from a now-dead field. The sound the wind made the year the barn roof caved in. Their memory was a village archive, curated in wrinkles and silences. And when the younger generations grew anxious, when the food stores looked low or the firewood seemed too small, they would ask, "Have you seen a winter like this before?" And the elder would nod. Yes. 3 times. They'd describe the patterns. The solutions. The mistakes to avoid. Don't eat all the root vegetables now. You'll need some for planting. Don't burn the green wood. It'll smoke too much and not heat the room. Don't go out during the ice moon. That's when the river spirits test the foolish. Their words were a map through the frost. And though they moved slowly, they still worked. They tended the fire when others were out. They rocked the babies. They sat beside the sick. They whispered prayers in languages that no longer had names. Their presence was as much a tool of survival as a knife or a cloak. In times of mourning, when someone was lost to the cold or to illness, it was the elders who led the rites. Not with grand rituals but with simple acts. The placing of a sprig of holly. The lighting of a single candle. The singing of a song that hadn't been sung since the last time loss came to town. Even their silence taught lessons. How to listen. How to wait. How to endure. And when spring finally came, when the snow melted and the ground showed itself once more, it was the elders who remembered what to do next. Where to plant first. When to let the animals out. Which herbs to gather now that the sun was back. They were the keepers of the wheel, guiding each season into the next. And perhaps most importantly, they taught gratitude. Not through speeches, but through presence. By noticing the warmth of the sun on the floorboards. By giving thanks for a loaf of bread that didn't mold. By smiling when the fire sparked high. By sighing in relief when the roof held against the storm. They taught that every winter survived was a triumph, not just of body, but of spirit. And when at last the elders passed on, their knowledge didn't die. It lingered in the hands of their children. In the way a son tied his boots. In the way a daughter mended the cloak. In the words a young mother whispered to her baby before bed, words her own mother had whispered before her. That's how wisdom survived in medieval winters. Not in books. Not in monuments. But in memory, ritual, and care. And if you were lucky enough to live beside an elder in those days, you didn't just survive the winter. You understood it. You learned to listen to the snow. To respect the wind. To prepare, not out of fear but out of love. Because winter wasn't just a season to endure. It was a teacher. And the elders were its voice. You've traveled far tonight, through frostbitten fields, smoky hearths, and the quiet strength of people long gone. Their winters were cruel, but their courage was quiet. Their world was harsh, but their hearts endured. So as you rest beneath warm blankets and walls that don't shudder in the wind, breathe in the peace they never had. You felt their hunger, their hope, their heaviness, and now you can let it go. The fire has burned low. The stories have all been told. Sleep well, modern soul. You've survived the Middle Ages, if only in a dream. Good night.